stories of people in the past who lived that history. And that's why I think Eliot's talk today is so important. I've taken too much time on it.
You know, I once read a study that the thing that people fear most, actually more than death, is public speaking. Now I understand why. My name is Eliot Fiks. I own and founded Hole in the Wall Restaurant, and I am the child and grandchild of Holocaust survivors. People mistakenly assume that a Holocaust survivor was someone who was in a concentration camp. In actuality, any victim of the Holocaust who found a way to survive is a Holocaust survivor. And so my parents and grandparents and some of my immediate family were the lucky ones who made it out, who were able to escape. The rest of my family was not so lucky. You know, when you hear the term Nazi, it's indelibly connected with the country of Germany. And so you conjure up a lot of images about that. Many people don't realize that actually prior to World War II and the Nazis, that Germany was considered the America of Europe by the Jews of the world. It was the most liberal, the most accepting of Jews. As a matter of fact, my grandfather, who was born in Poland, was conscripted into the into the Russian army during World War I. And during that time, he was captured by the Germans. And he was very well treated as a prisoner of war. He actually wrote to my grandmother that as a Jew, he was treated better as a German prisoner of war than he was as a Jew in the Russian army. And so after World War I, he and my grandmother emigrated to Germany. My grandfather was a furrier by trade, so he set up a successful business there and built a family. But as you students of history may know, Germany after World War I was in very bad shape, both economically and just in many other ways, because they were devastated by, you know, some of the reparations and the terms of surrender. These conditions gave rise to the development of extremist views, as those espoused by Hitler. And in 1933, Hitler was able to take power. Once he took power, there were a series of anti-Semitic edicts that came down one by one, each becoming more and more extreme, as Doug described a little bit of. A lot of Jewish German families that could afford to and were able to send their teenage children to the United States. The idea was that if things got better, they would have their children return. If things got worse, they would have their children establish a beachhead of sorts to hopefully eventually bring the parents over. Of course, as we know, things did in fact get worse. In 1938, on November 7th, a seemingly small event occurred, and that was in France, a member of the German embassy by the name of Rath was shot by a young Jewish man who was very upset because all the Polish Jews that were in Germany, about 20,000, were deported to Poland. That event was sort of the excuse, as it were, the killing of the Archduke Ferdinand for the Germans to launch the Kristallnacht, or Night of the Broken Glass. The letter that I'm about to read excerpts of is my grandfather's letter that was written to my father in the United States. My son, you asked me to describe the November pogroms and the pogrom in our home. They didn't start in November. Indirectly, they began long before. Earlier already, all Jews living in the German Reich had to mark their shops as Jewish. Earlier already, the Jews had to surrender all the weapons. Earlier already did the Nazi Party sign the order that on November 9th, all Jewish store owners would be hanged in front of their shop doors. Earlier already had the Goebbels press written in real large letters that the Jews were powerless and disarmed. In other words, take advantage of this situation. Earlier already had they hired their boys to carry out this bloody thing in a commando action when Jewish blood spurts from the knife. It was one of the horrible nights after the announcement of Rath's death. A terrible feeling entered the heart of all Jewish persons. Everyone, without saying it, thought anxiously that something strange and terrible and cruel was about to happen. Filled with anxiety and sorrow, everyone tried to hide inside their four walls. Never in my life will I ever forget the moment shortly after midnight when someone knocked loudly on the door of the store where we were still working. Mrs. Lowenstein, pale, as if neither dead nor alive, starting to sob miserably. "You are still here?" was her first question. My uncle, who was Gestapo chief, advised us strongly that no Jewish men ought to sleep at home because they would all be arrested and killed. She added, "He is reliable. He sits at the source." We all remained sitting as if turned to stone. It's starting, I thought, but since there was little time for thinking what to do, as it was supposed to begin at 2 a.m., we decided that I should spend the night at the store. Walter went to his friend Sanger's, who was an Aryan. Mother and the rest went home. Can you imagine, dear Max, how I felt at this moment? Thoughts flew by as if in a storm. I'm not sure if I slept or not, while before my inner eye, my whole life burned by. As a 22-year-old, healthy and full of life, and an honest person, myself and my wife tried to make Berlin our second home. Our way was not strewn with roses. With effort and step by step, we followed our path. The dearest and most precious is my family and work. A new existence established, and now suddenly is all coming to a sudden end. Should our joint 21 years of work and worry be for nothing? Shall I now pay with my life as a declared state criminal, a thief, a murderer, and not least as a Jew? Has it all come to an end? While my thoughts were bringing me to this point, I was suddenly surprised by the crash of 2 or 3 big stones thrown into our shop display window. The bearers of European culture had arrived, first smashing the window of David ben Rabbi Shul Chaim. I jumped up and from my easy chair immediately fell back down as a huge rock hit me on the foot, and I thought, well, is this my end? The windows have already been broken, they'll smash the furniture next, and then my last hour will have arrived. Luckily, it was only a window-breaking group. Outside, I could hear their triumphant shouts like Judas, traitors, kill the Jew, when Jewish blood spurts from the knife, kill Rath's murderers, and the warmongers, etc. In the meantime, I stood up again and peeked through a crack in the display window because all the merchandise was still lying on exhibit. At just that moment, the other group arrived, the ones to whom the Fuhrer had promised that the Jewish shop shall belong to them. In front of the broken window, they talked. Go ahead and catch one of these little animals. Just one, he says. At the same time, I'll catch another for Kath. And in just a wink, a Kamchek red fox and a silver fox were in the hands of the German men. For the moment, they couldn't catch any more, because as soon as they turned their backs, I had removed the rest of the goods to the back of the shop, of course, without making a sound. I hid in a corner of the sewing room because I couldn't stand to hear their triumphant shouts or breaking of more glass anymore. At 3:30, another group of German men arrived, and they finished up the shop window. What a horrible, black, and cold night that was, and it seemed as if daylight would never come. It stayed so dark, and with this, the civilization of the 20th century had arrived at its high point. Or was it the end of the world? Or am I watching a Shakespearean drama and listening to the words that life is only a vanishing shadow? And man, a poor actor, who shouts and cries on the stage till the end. Such thoughts went through my mind till about 6:30 when the telephone rang. It was Mrs. Perelstadt begging and sobbing for my help. Because her shop had an iron shutter, the men couldn't break in the front. So they went around back, broke through a kitchen window and entered. Mrs. P was alone with Felix. Her husband, together with Moxie, had already been taken away in the Jewish-Polish operation. Hearing the sound of breaking glass, Mrs. P thought someone was breaking in and ran down her stairs. With horrible surprise, she saw in front of her eyes 6 strong German men. "Here are the Nazis," they shouted, "you Jewish bitch. Where is the Jew?" She couldn't utter a single word. So they started to break all the furniture and other things in the apartment, not stopping till everything was smashed, yelling Heil Hitler when they finally left. Around 7:30 in the morning, when Marie went out to get milk, she saw all the damage. She couldn't stop crying and rushed to the apartment to get Mother. When I saw Mother, I broke down completely. I yelled as loud as I could. But sometimes he becomes stronger than steel, and that's what happened with me. Our people arrived for work as if nothing had happened, and worked till 11 a.m. when an Aryan lady, a client of ours, arrived and told us while sobbing, "Dear friends, close up now. On the Kurfürsten Damm, they have started to demolish the interiors of places. The synagogues and the whole Reich are burning. The fire departments watch, disinterested. The police do nothing. The goods from the demolished stores are thrown into the streets. Some are burned, some are looted. It's horrible. Close your store fast. They are already in the Wilhelmstrasse too." We looked outside, all true. They were inside Saks' store already. We locked ourselves in fast, and within a few minutes, a horde of about 20 men arrived in front of our workshop window, armed with metal pipes, axes, and hammers, and their work started anew. We had all hidden ourselves in the closets. With each broken window, they sang their Deutschlandlieder. When they finished with the windows and found out they couldn't get through, they started on the kitchen door, where Muller used to work. In no time, they broke through the iron shutter. Among them were real heavyweights, used to breaking in. In my hideaway in the closet, I heard a shout, "Where is the fur Jew, the pig, the betrayer of the German nation? He should be beaten to death." It didn't matter anymore. You must make it to the street the fastest way possible, I thought to myself. For to fight them made no sense. And I made it. When the gangsters went back towards the last room, I ran in the front of the shop through the windowless door where the shutters had been opened. Wearing my work apron, I ran full speed into house number 42, up the stairs to the 4th floor, ringing the bell at each door, begging tearfully to be let in, but without success. At the last door, I rang for some seconds, and a 9-year-old girl opened the door. I couldn't form any words anymore, and speechless, thrust myself into the apartment. Her mother, a well-dressed Aryan lady, appeared and asked me what I wanted. I answered sobbingly, Save me, dear lady, they're after me. Who are you then, was her question. I am Fiks, no thief, no murderer, no traitor. I am only a Jew and a family man. It's a matter of life or death, hide me. Do with me what you will, I'm not leaving this apartment. How dare you talk to me this way? My husband is a member of the Nazi Party's steering committee. He will be back soon. They'll probably shoot you right here, and then I'll get it too for daring to hide you in my apartment. Then I had an idea. Please lock me in your attic, and in a few hours when it gets dark, let me out. You'll save a father of a family and a human being. This she finally agreed to do, and so I spent about 4 hours under a laundry basket in the attic. While this was going on, my father in the United States was feverishly trying to get visas for my grandparents and my uncle to come to the United States. In doing so, he needed a lawyer. Well, it so happens that my mother's family had escaped from Vienna and they were living in Brooklyn, and my mother's father was a lawyer. Her father had contracted cancer at the time, so he was operating out of his house in Brooklyn. So my father would come there to work on my grandparents' visas. He had also enlisted in the United States Army in order to get preferential treatment for his parents to get the visas. When he came to my mother's house, that's how he met her, and they started going on a few dates. Shortly after they met, he was called up for service. He asked my mother if he could correspond with her, and she said yes. And that's how their relationship happened. I have composed a song that I wrote about my father's World War II experiences that I would like to perform for you. And it's written as if my father was singing the song to my as yet unborn child. The song is called Let Me Tell You a Tale. Sit by my side, my little one, and I will tell you a tale. Though this face is gray and tired, and the house is up for sale, oh, let me tell you, please let me tell you, oh, let me tell you a tale. I was just a boy of 16 when I first came to this land. Endless madness was just beginning, so I drew my line in the sand. Oh, let me tell you, please let me tell you, oh, let me tell you a tale. My folks were still in Berlin then, wrestling to break free. The best chance he had to make it across was going to be me. I turned every corner, wrote every letter, and I knocked on every door. What it finally took was signing up. Don't fight in that war. German mummies came on strong. Japanese did too. Took all we had to quell that tide, and I just hung on to make it through. The man on me made my parents' visas fly, brought me to his home. His fetching daughter caught my eye. There a seed was sown. I wrote to her, she wrote to me. That's how our love began. And when the war was over, I asked for her hand. And looking back, I still see her eyes. And I moved to Brooklyn in 1945. Oh, I can't say our lives went as planned. Grant me just one cheese wish, I'd do it all again. So let me tell you, please let me tell you, oh, let me tell you a tale. I'm happy to take any questions or comments or suggestions.
So
Today we're faced with a situation where we see many people trying to come to our country as refugees, as your family did. And I think it's something that all of us have to look into our hearts, kind of like that Nazi lady, and do something. Thank you for your expression.
do you remember your grandfather?
I do. We used to go to his house in Brooklyn on weekends when I was a kid.
And did he tell you much about he was in World War I?
He was.
And did he tell you stories?
He told me some stories. He knew many languages. He knew about 10 different languages, including a language called Esperanto. Are you familiar with it?
Yes.
For those of you who don't know, Esperanto was a language developed to be an international language in the late 1800s. It never quite caught on. But yes, according to him, some kind of espionage work in World War I, and in the course of that, it was in the winter, and he, I guess, had contracted some kind of flu or some kind of severe thing, and he literally just fell down sick in the snow and would have died, but the Germans found him and took him prisoner, and they actually saved his life. So.
And last question, I understand that the U.S. Congress during World War II were the most anti-Semitic ever in our history, and would not allow Jews to come in as refugees during the war. What was the situation with your grandparents coming into America? When did they come in?
Well, before I answer that question directly, I'll speak to the whole comment, and that is that a lot of people don't know that many of the Jews who were able to come to America came to America because of the Cuban government. I'm alive today because of a corrupt dictator in Cuba by the name of Batista, because what Jews were able to do was to bribe them, the Cuban government, to get a Cuban visa, and so then they were coming to America with a Cuban visa, and that's how both my father's family and my mother's family were able to survive.
Wow, that's fascinating. I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Wow. Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you for the presentation and sharing. There's a significant amount of research and popular literature that I think clearly indicates there has been a rise in anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, racism, all sorts of isms. So my question is, in terms of your personal history, your experiences, are you concerned about where things are right now in the United States concerning hatred, concerning discrimination, concerning oppression, marginalization?
I am, and I have to admit myself that, you know, there's a term that was coined, never again. And, you know, I always thought to myself, well, that's a great term and it's important, but I thought, well, let's be realistic. It's nothing like that is ever going to happen again. But, you know, I didn't think that Trump would actually get elected, and I think, unfortunately, whether you're for some of his policies or against them, it's true that something, I don't even think it's necessarily about what he says, but just something about his persona is giving rise to some of these events. I don't think it's just him, because it's happening that, you know, that right-wing dictators are taking power and there's all this hatred happening all over the world. So I think he's part of a larger thing, but at least in this country, I think he is part of the vehicle that is allowing this stuff to come out. So yes, it's quite disturbing.
Eliot, your father fought in World War II.
Yes, he did.
Where was he sent? I'm just sort of curious. Did he end up in Europe?
No, it's funny. He wanted to fight the Germans, of course, and he requested that. And of course, he was fluent in German, so he would have been perfect for, you know, translation, interrogation, that kind of thing. But in what my father used to refer to as Army intelligence, they sent him to the Aleutian Islands off the coast of Alaska.
There you go.
To fight the Japanese, and then they took his American cousin and they sent him to school to learn German,
Yeah.
to do what my father would have wanted to do. Yeah, a lot of people don't know, but the Japanese were fighting the United States on American soil in the Aleutian Islands off the coast of Alaska.
Yes.
That's where he was. And I actually got a great gift towards the end of my parents' life. I had been told by my parents my whole life that there were these love letters from World War II. But you know, you're a child and you don't think, well, do these letters still exist? Can I read these letters? You know, what's the story? But after my mother died, I was cleaning up the house and I came across my father's letters to my mother. So I asked my father if I could read them, and he said yes. And for a long time, you know, I couldn't read them. Actually, a couple months after my mother died, my father died of a broken heart, as happens sometimes. And for a long time, I couldn't even touch these letters. But I had a wonderful grief counselor, and one day he said, well, you know, just pick any letter out of the pile and bring it in, we'll read it together. So we began this wonderful journey where every week I would see him, I would take another letter in chronological order, and we would read it together for the first time. So I basically learned what, you know, my parents were like as 20-somethings falling in love as immigrants, you know, in the late 1930s, early 1940s. And actually by the end, we were almost coming to the end of my father's letters, and I was bemoaning that I only had my father's letters, but not my mother's. And I had spoken to my father and said, well, what happened to mommy's letters? And he said, oh, well, you know, I was in the service, moving around, so I couldn't keep them. But I was looking through some papers I had taken from my parents' house, and right around that time, for something else, something with Holocaust insurance, and I struck paper, and I found 25 of my mother's letters, many of them very long and typed out, and so I now possess all those letters, so it's a great, great gift to me.
Your grandfather had such great insight and wisdom. Two questions. One is, how soon after November 9th did he write those letters? And then the second thing I'm wondering is, what was his life like, his transition into the U.S.?
Well, I'm glad you asked that question because this letter was written after my grandparents and my uncle escaped to France a couple of months after. And actually, the letter was donated by my father at the end of his life to the Jewish Museum in Berlin. And I selfishly thought to myself, well, I wish he hadn't done that because that's this family heirloom, and actually we used to read a portion of the letter on the anniversary of Kristallnacht, November 9th, and it was a big family event. Well, about 6 months ago, I was contacted by a German historian, and the way that German historian got in touch with me was the song that I performed for you is on YouTube, and along with it, some photographs of my family and the history of my family. And so he figured out that I must be the grandson of David Fiks. And he told me something very interesting and moving, and that is that unlike what I thought, which is that there must be hundreds of these letters describing Kristallnacht, he said, no, you're mistaken, because all the other letters that exist were written by the Jewish men who were arrested, and they were put in concentration camps. And so their letters were all both short and censored. But my grandfather's letter was the opposite in every way. It was written in France, so it wasn't censored, and it was 24 pages long. So it's actually one of, if not the only letter that truly describes the events of Kristallnacht. And it's a big deal at the Jewish Museum in Berlin. He said they talk about it all the time and read it to various children's groups and stuff. And so I then understood the wisdom of my father's action. I felt very glad that he had donated that letter. As to your second question, I think for maybe not all, but many Jewish immigrants at that time, wasn't easy for him to become integrated. He did continue as a furrier and set up his own shop, but I don't think he never really achieved the same success that he had when he was in Berlin. And he really didn't speak about the events a lot, which, as you may know, is quite common. A lot of Holocaust survivors either never speak about it or only at the very end of their lives when they realize the time is short, they'll come out and do stuff. And that's why it's so important to support the people that do. I actually just came from visiting a friend of mine in Albany who's a 99-year-old Holocaust survivor, so she does a lot of talks. So she gave me advice for my talk today. She's given lots of them. Any other questions, anybody?
Sorry to ask another question, but
More the merrier.
I couldn't
have any planes to catch.
fair. I tend to think that our society, our moment, we have difficulty accepting and most certainly recognizing ideas associated with collective trauma, historical trauma, mourning, community, and collective mourning. And with a few people in the room who teach history, I wonder what you would think should be the goal in terms of not only having our students understand the history associated with these events, but also what do you think should be the goal in terms of emotional connectivity?
So I guess, you know, if I had to answer without more thought, which I think to fully answer your question requires, you know, some deep thought. But I think that for people to hear as many stories as possible, I know there are some projects that have happened to videotape the stories of Holocaust survivors. I think Steven Spielberg is the main one. So I would say sit people down and get a hold of some of those videotapes and have people watch, have people talk about it. I think that's at least a big part of the answer to your question.
Eliot, do you know if there are any Holocaust survivors still alive in the area? I knew there had been some.
Well, at our 80th commemoration of Kristallnacht, there was that
Right.
gentleman. I know there were a number. Dave, do you know? Are there any people? I would say probably we should ask around at the temples and the JCC. I think there may be a couple left, but most of the people that I know who had been here for, you know, their whole lives and such, like, have passed away. But there's probably some. And my friend who lives in Albany, if someone, you know, wanted to make that happen, we might be able to convince her to.
And last question from me. Did your grandfather ever find out what happened to the well-dressed Aryan woman who took him in?
You know, I never heard that story, and because I'm in contact with this German historian who seems open to possibly doing more research, the thought crossed my mind that is a 9-year-old girl still alive, you know, and to try and find her. But I don't know exactly what happened. In 1987, I went on a trip to see what was left of my grandfather's shop, and also go to Dachau and to go to Vienna and see where my mother had lived. And when I went to Berlin, the place that my grandfather's shop had been torn down, and there was an apartment building. But I met a man who lived in that apartment building, and he took me down to the basement, because the basement, they had built the building over the original basement, so it was my grandfather's basement, so I took some photos down there. And I also went into, I didn't know at that time that it was address number 42, but I went into a nearby old building across the street, and I went up to the attic and I took a number of black and white photographs from the perspective that my grandfather would have had looking down onto the street where the Nazis were.
Thank you.
And also, actually, just to tell the end of the story for my grandparents, after they escaped to Paris, they then made their way to the southern port of Marseille, and they took the last boat out of Marseille before the Nazis took over, and they went to Casablanca. And in Casablanca, they were waiting for a boat to go to Cuba. But while they were in Casablanca, their visas ran out. And so they weren't going to let them on the boat, and apparently there was some big scene where my grandfather, was threatening to commit suicide, and they finally, let them onto the boat.
So there's more to the Casablanca story than the movies showed.
Yes, and I've always loved that movie. It's one of my favorite movies, so it's interesting to have that personal connection to Casablanca. To know that it really was like that, It really was this city of immigrants escaping the Nazis.
And all woven around a missing visa.
Right. Even that.
I think you're really on to the core of the answer to Scott's question. I'd add that when you point out how important narrative is, honeybees make honey, human beings tell stories. That's what we do. And history's always been about narrative. And I would just add that the Historia of Herodotus, the so-called father of history, not only is the word history in Greek, it's also the word story. And that's what we have to do, tell stories that connect. Thank you again.
Of course, my song is entitled Let Me Tell You a Tale, so there you go, it all fits in together.
Right.
Any other questions?
What was your grandfather's education level? Because he's obviously a beautiful writer.
That's a good question that I should know the answer to. I am almost positive that he did not go to college. I think he probably was, because he was trained as a furrier, but being a Jew growing up in Poland, I think studies probably mostly through, religious kind of direction. I think he was a studious man, but I don't think he had virtually any formal education. And it's actually interesting to read both my parents' letters, because there are people who, had just learned the English language for a short time, but their letters are just incredible. My father, in one letter, almost predicts the civil rights movement, because there was a certain level of integration between blacks and whites during the war, and he makes a comment in one letter that he didn't think that black people would be willing to, go back to the way things were before. And so, to me, that really was like a prediction of the civil rights movement. But just the writing itself was unbelievable. Their command of the English language, I think, is better than some of us today. So. Anybody else have anything they'd like to say?
Eliot, on behalf of the college, we are so appreciative of you being with us today, and we look forward to the English copy of this letter, because we have plans to it also another place.
That sounds great.
And I'm going to tell you something. You make a terrific mushroom soup. Other great dishes. But what I saw
Hey, no free ads, Doug.
what I saw here today, I think he has another career if he wanted